Now.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guests today are, well, Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez and Joe Torres. They've just completed a masterpiece, News for All the People, the epic story of race in the American media. This begins their tour around the country as they speak in New York, in the Bay Area, in Los Angeles, in New Mexico, in Colorado, and Washington, D.C., to tell the story of race as a central theme in the development of the U.S. media. Now, that song you were just listening to was not just any song. Juan, not that you're related, but can you talk about who Pedro Gonzalez was?
Well, Pedro Gonzalez was one of those unsung heroes of American media and journalism. He was a radio host, a singer, actually. That was originally a telegraph operator in Mexico who then came to the United States and became a radio host in the 1930s in Los Angeles. And he had a morning show, Los Madrugadores, where basically he was talking to and playing songs for the migrant workers who were working in the fields early in the morning. And in the 1930s, President Herbert Hoover instituted a mass deportation program to ship Mexican immigrants back to Mexico. It was at the height of the Depression, and the media was stirring up, just as they are now, anti-immigrant fervor. And so there was a massive deportation program where about 1 million Mexicans were shipped back to Mexico. And Pedro Gonzalez was one of the few radio announcers in those days who was constantly condemning these raids, these immigration raids and deportations on his radio station. He was suddenly arrested by the Los Angeles district attorney and charged with on a fabricated rape charge and sentenced to San Quentin prison. Where in 1939 he actually organized a hunger strike of the inmates of San Quentin against conditions in the prison system. Sounds very modern, doesn't it, in terms of his activities. Eventually, it turned out that his accuser recanted and admitted that she had been put up to the charges by authorities, and Pedro Gonzalez was released from prison, but immediately deported to Mexico, where he ended up in Tijuana for many years as a radio announcer. Eventually came back to the United States, where he died here at the age of 99 several years ago. But he was one of these early heroes who used his media platform to try to stand against injustice for immigrant workers. But he's virtually unknown. I mean, there was a PBS documentary that was done on him several years ago, but largely in most media histories, you never hear about him. Some of the songs that you're playing are from one of his albums, because, as I said, he was a popular singer of his day. And there were actually corridos, ballads written about the injustices of the jailing of Pedro Gonzalez in the 1930s.
Go back to colonial times, the first newspaper in the United States, its significance, and then take us forward.
Well, see, this is what people don't know. It's true that African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans were not employed by the media until really in large numbers till the 1970s. But race has always been a major topic of the American media from the start. And we went back to the first newspaper in North America, Public Occurrences, in 1690 in Boston. It was a 3-page sheet, and the first newspaper, and it was suppressed by the Massachusetts Council after one issue because it had some provocative articles in it. But when you read the first newspaper, you realize that the bulk of the content, 5 articles in that newspaper, is intelligence to the settlers about what the Native Americans are up to. Basically, to quote the Benjamin Harris, who was the editor and publisher of the paper, he says at one point when he's talking about the Mohawks and the battles of the Massachusetts colony with the Canadian settlers. He says, if Almighty God will have Canada to be subdued without the assistance of those miserable savages, we shall be glad. And all of the articles were about the threats of Native Americans, except there was one positive article, and that was about how some Christianized Indians in Plymouth were giving thanks to God on Thanksgiving. But generally, and so public occurrences set the prototype for how race would be covered in America, because every newspaper subsequent to that, throughout the colonial period, a huge portion of the content of newspapers was for the settlers to know what the Indians were up to.
And then we can go to the quote in Joe and Juan's book from the New York Tribune editor and publisher Horace Greeley. In an 1854 account of his trip to the western frontier, Greeley wrote, "I have learned to appreciate the dislike, aversion, contempt wherewith Indians are usually regarded by their white neighbors and have been since the days of the Puritans."
Yes, well, interestingly, Greeley was well known in the 19th century as one who was opposed to slavery. He was a publisher who constantly railed against slavery. But when it came to Native Americans and when it came to the Chinese immigrants, he was incredibly racist in the kind of coverage that his paper, which was the New York Times of its day, the Tribune in the mid and late 19th century was the paper of record in the United States. And Greeley was amazingly racist toward Native Americans and toward the Chinese, while at the same time advocating abolition of slavery.
On the issue of Native Americans, Joe Torres, can you talk about Ora Edelman Reed, known as the Sunshine Lady?
Sure. She is her family mother owned a newspaper in Oklahoma, and she ended up taking over the business and running a magazine called Twin Territories, which really became a place where Native American literature really thrived. And she went on in Casper, Wyoming, to a station in 1924 to really be the first Native American to be a broadcaster, and it just shows that it is an example how early on how there were several people, there were several journalists of color who actually worked in the mainstream. Her mother owned, and her sister and her, they worked in the mainstream press. And it's a few examples, not too many, but there are a few examples, 100, 150 years ago, where people of color actually worked in the mainstream press, and she's a prime example.
Well, another example that totally unknown, John Rollin Ridge, a Cherokee Indian writer, novelist, wrote a novel about Joaquin Murrieta, the California so-called bandit. But John Rollin Ridge ended up moving to California and founding the Sacramento Bee. And being the first editor and publisher of the Sacramento Bee. He eventually sold the paper to James McClatchy, one of his employees. And of course, McClatchy developed the Sacramento Bee into the flagship newspaper of the McClatchy newspaper chain. You go to the McClatchy history on their website, or their official history, there's no mention that a Cherokee Indian was the founder of their flagship paper. They make it seem like James McClatchy actually started the Bee. But it's this kind of expunging of the actual history of African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans in the development of the American press that is what really another major theme of our book is to resurrect that history and have a more inclusive history of how our press developed, that there were all kinds of folks who played pivotal roles and actually heroic roles in the development of a free press in America that have been expunged from the official histories.
Joe Torres.